Is that him? Arx Jundal's voice carved through the silence like a blade drawn too fast. The ripple of his contempt rolled across the summit chamber, stirring hushed amusement among the seated delegates. That's Earth's envoy? I thought they buried their diplomats with the last ice age. The others didn't laugh. Not yet. They were watching. From the far end of the mediation hall, the doors parted with hydraulic finality. In stepped Darren Vosk, alone. He didn't pause. No escort flanked him. No emblems marked his black tunic. He walked as if the chamber were already ruins, and he had come not to speak but to witness the remains. His boots struck the crystalline floor with muted cadence, solid, unhurried, as though measuring the width of judgment. With each step, the glow beneath the tiles hesitated, flickering in an almost imperceptible lag. Sensors embedded in the marble blinked in confusion, struggling to read him. The air inside Carintera's central hall carried the scent of archival resin and sun-warmed stone. Old debates had soaked into the walls here, somewhere between sanctum and tomb. Above, the council banners swayed slightly, tugged by the circulation ducts hidden in the vaulting. Voltron Sir leaned toward Eric's, his scaled jaw flexing with quiet tension. He's not broadcasting credentials. Let him walk, Arix muttered. The ghost will vanish soon enough. Darren said nothing. The human envoy moved like a man who had memorized the terrain long before the walls existed. His hands remained behind his back, one thumb brushing the edge of a thin silver band around his wrist. No insignia, just metal, functional, ambiguous. Near the diplomatic circle, Tharnik Vol watched him with narrowed pupils. The gill plates along his throat lifted and settled in a slow rhythm, a nervous reaction. The floor sensors at Tharnik's feet buzzed twice and dimmed. He checked his interface slate. Nothing reported wrong. The Earth seat waited, untouched for 47 cycles. One chair among many, its back low, its surface undecorated. The council had placed it intentionally at the far end of the semicircle, an architectural afterthought for a world believed to be obsolete. Now the chair had someone walking toward it. Broadcast drones hovered silently around the perimeter, laser plasma cameras capturing every shift in posture, every blink. In the shadows of the broadcast deck, Drask Merrick adjusted the magnification feed. Closer on the face, he ordered. No tighter. The eyes. The feed zoomed. Darren's face filled the screen, calm, uncreased, unreadable, the kind of expression you'd find not in statesmen, but in surgeons between heartbeats. A translator node sparked near the Grithian delegate, crackle, then a hiccup of gibberish. Aides replaced the device with mechanical speed, offering apologies in 6 languages. The moment passed. Vosk reached the center of the chamber. He did not bow, he did not introduce himself. He simply turned to face the half-circle of worlds seated before him. 50 banners, 50 thrones, 50 empires built on noise and polished ritual. The silence he brought was not empty. It pressed outward, a presence mistaken for stillness. Arix Jundal straightened in his ornate seat, his voice smooth and deliberate. Envoy Vosk, Earth was not expected. Your world has offered neither proposal nor petition. Shall we assume you arrive seeking clemency? Vosk's head tilted a fraction, an acknowledgement, or something close. No reply. A flicker passed through the heads-up displays embedded into the table rims. Not a glitch, just an inconsistency. Earth's designation tile blinked twice and reset. Several aides looked up, confused. Voltron tapped his embedded panel. Response lagged half a second longer than protocol allowed. Tharnik spoke next. You enter unarmed, no translators, no defense entourage. Why are you here? Finally, Vosk moved. He lifted his left hand. The silver band on his wrist brightened, casting a grid of light across the council floor, a laser plasma display blooming into slow, deliberate formation. A storm appeared, not figurative, real. The display showed Earth's southern oceans in their worst season. Monsoons tearing at cities built too close to survival. Waves colliding with cliffside infrastructure. Black lightning carving paths through forested ridgelines. No narration. No commentary. Then another frame, an interior shot. A training chamber carved into volcanic bedrock, men submerged in cryo depths while synthetic fire rolled across the surface. The display offered no context, just layered imagery, endurance, reaction, silence. Jundal barked a laugh. Is this a bid for sympathy? Vosk let the projection roll into the next segment. A single corridor, lit by dim biosensors, where a human stood unmoving as every surface shifted and tested him. A psychological gauntlet, more prison than training space. No one asked for the meaning, but some began to understand. Tharnik leaned closer to his aide. Cross-reference that chamber with Terran infrastructure, category black level. The aide hesitated. Sir, there's no live connection. Earth isn't returning handshake signals. Run it again. I've run it twice. A small static charge danced along the edge of the Grithian's throne. Darren spoke for the first time. His voice was low, intact, controlled. Earth does not petition. The words dropped into the chamber like a slow stone into deep water. No splash, only ripples through the unseen. He said no more. Arik straightened, the muscles along his neck tight. Then Earth intends to do what, exactly? A second display bloomed beside the first, this one mapping orbital positions. Karin Terra's defensive satellites, relay ships, surveillance buoys, all pulsing in perfect synchronicity, until one winked out. Just one, a blip, gone. Drask Myrick's camera feed stuttered. Marvek Dor, stationed in silent orbit aboard the Obsidian array, adjusted the passive uplink and made a single notation. Sequence registered. Observer clock initiated. The council chamber did not react immediately. Too much ceremony, too much pride, and the disappearance of one satellite could be explained. Vosk ended the display with a subtle motion. The lights folded inward and vanished. He turned slowly toward the Earth seat, and sat. The banners above the chamber dipped again, this time not from breeze, but from the atmospheric regulators, attempting to compensate for an imbalance they could not locate. Behind his calm, behind the unspoken insult of presence, Darren Vosk did not think of this moment. He thought of another, of Arvek Halden, kneeling in the ashes of a summit gone wrong, his voice failing not from harm, but from the collapse of meaning. His final words, not shouted, not desperate, only this: make silence expensive. And so Vosk sat now, alone. The council still believed itself intact, but the room had already begun to disassemble. He folded his hands in his lap. The trap had not been sprung. It had begun long before they ever saw him walk through those doors. He hasn't blinked in 2 minutes, muttered Tharnik Vol, wiping moisture from beneath his lower lid, as if Darren Vosk's stillness infected the room. The council's dais had grown strangely cold, not temperature-wise, that remained constant by design. But something had shifted in the air since the envoy sat. Conversation that once carried arrogance now thinned into muttered exchanges and half-sentences. Voltron Sur reviewed his armrest's interface. The weapon locker indicators around the chamber had flickered red. He tapped the icon again. The status stuttered, then returned to green. Normal, functioning, stable. He didn't believe it. Near the summit's east wall, a translator node let out a screeching garble. Words tumbled into the wrong syntax. Ratify the collapse before the storm came from a minor delegate's earpiece, though no one had spoken. The aide flinched, yanked the device free, and passed it off to a technician without speaking. Yarrick Venn, scribal observer, stopped writing. His fingers hovered over his slate as he listened to the wrongness unfurl around him. He wasn't sure if the human envoy was doing anything. That was the trap. Vosk hadn't moved in 6 full minutes. Another banner overhead sagged lower than protocol allowed. It dipped into the spotlight's beam, its golden fringe brushing the floor. No one stepped forward to lift it. No one noticed when another snapped silently at its seam and fell behind the Jarnik delegation's throne. Inside the summit's power grid, readings fluctuated by tenths. Regulators overcompensated. Subtle hissings from wall vents filled gaps where diplomatic voices should have echoed. Kelvon Rax reviewed internal security. A slight uptick in atmospheric density. Readouts flagged non-critical fluctuation, but the numbers made no sense. The barometric pattern was inverted, as if the chamber itself had begun to pull inward. We should issue a procedural recalibration, Rax said quietly to Voltron. Voltron didn't respond. His hand rested near the magnetic pulse control, but he didn't touch it. Darren Vosk shifted his weight, just a fraction. Chairs creaked. Delegates turned toward each other with shallow exhales. The kind of motion usually dismissed, a man shifting position. But here, now, it was a signal. Laser plasma displays rippled. Data streams flickered once, twice. Earth's ID tag on the chamber's active participant list cycled into blank code, then returned. No name, just the seat, occupied. Drask Merrick adjusted the summit broadcast filters. The core lens, trained on the envoy, had stopped responding to zoom commands. The image remained fixed, centered, steady, slightly too clear. Merrick leaned toward his assistant. Manual override. Locked, came the reply. Eric's Jundal noticed the unease. He stood, pacing once toward the edge of the dais. Enough silence, he said, voice attempting to fill the chamber. If Earth has nothing to say, then we continue without them. The room didn't echo. His words fell flat, swallowed by the walls. It wasn't acoustics. Something muted the bounce. The sound just ended. Eric's frowned. Did the dampeners reset? Kelvon Rax tapped his control. A thin shudder traveled through the floor, then a flicker across the room's lighting array. One light above the main entrance snapped off, another dimmed. The council guards at the far corners tightened their grip on their weapons. One reached for the hilt of his null blade, and paused. The sheath was open. The blade was gone. He turned, heart pounding, and found it resting on the floor beside him, unmoved, untouched, as though it had decided to slip free on its own. Vosk blinked. Drask Merrick swore softly. Did you see that feed stutter? Everything stuttered, his tech replied. We're ghosting somewhere in the relay. Voltron Sir stood. Security sweep. Quiet. No announcements. He gestured to the guards near the chamber exits. Two nodded, stepping into the side corridors. Inside the observation decks, aides began whispering over closed-loop channels. One by one, feedback loops buzzed into their ears, distorted echoes, words out of sequence. He's already inside, came the looped fragment. Inside what? Someone whispered. Everything, answered the echo. Yorick Venn watched the banners. Now 5 of them had drooped to the floor. The embroidered planets they represented looked drowned, curling inward. He tapped his stylus against the slate, uncertain what to record. Another chair shifted without occupant. I want a status report, Tharnik Vol growled. From whom? Voltron asked. The silence that followed tasted dry, like air drawn through an ancient crypt, where breath thickens and won't pass easily through the throat. Jundal turned again to Vosk. Say something, he said. Not as a challenge, as a plea. Vosk looked up. The look was not cruel, not victorious, simply inevitable. From beneath the chamber floor, a low, resonant clicking began, barely audible, mechanical, but soft, as if hundreds of joints were unlocking beneath the marble. Kelvon Rax spun his display again. The power readings leveled. The temperature stabilized. The diagnostics read perfect. And that, finally, terrified him. Nothing's wrong, he said aloud. Voltron nodded slowly. That's how you know. Eric's approached the Earth seat. The guards didn't move. The air around Vosk seemed thicker now, like heat distortion, only cold. A trick of the eye. Or perhaps the mind rejecting what the eye reported. Eric's reached out. I'll have your answers, human. As his fingers neared Vosk's shoulder, the lights blinked again, just once, and behind the dais, a section of wall opened with no sound, not a door, not a mechanism, just separation, a thin seam that widened into black. From it, a gust escaped. Not air, not gas, something older, the scent of burnt soil and sterile ash. Vosk never flinched. Inside the command decks, orbiting Corinne Terra, red notifications queued in silent succession. All red, status nominal, all lied. In the broadcast pit, Drask Merrick looked at the frozen feed and whispered, "We lost the story." Yorick Venn scratched a final line into his slate. "Move aside, coward." Arix Jundal's voice struck the chamber like a thrown stone, brittle and cutting. It bounced off the marble walls and lodged itself in the rib cages of the watching council. He stepped forward from his high seat, boots colliding with the floor in hard intervals that echoed beneath the banners above. Jern Vosk didn't turn. His spine remained a sculpted line, chin steady, shoulders still. Silence framed him like an old painting, a reminder of something forgotten. Arix crossed the dais, his ceremonial sash dragging like a wound, the air folding around him in thick, uneven bands. He advanced with the kind of certainty that grows from unchecked victories, chest drawn wide, fingers curled into practiced menace. The guards shifted but didn't move. They had orders, but none imagined they'd be needed. "Say something," Arx hissed. Stillness. The council chamber was quieter than before, but not with reverence. It was the hush before a lock gives way. Arx lifted both hands and drove them into Darren's chest. The impact was raw, brutal in its simplicity. Darren staggered backward, shoes sliding against the polished surface, limbs refusing the instinct to brace. His body hit the floor with a dull slap, skin meeting stone, breath driven from his lungs in a whisper too thin to name. The room didn't gasp. It inhaled as one. Blood trickled from Darren's cheek, where it had grazed a broken mosaic shard. Crimson spread across the white stone like ink spilled on snow. Arx straightened, panting as if victory required exertion. "Let the record show," he spat, eyes sweeping the stunned witnesses. "Earth sends only ghosts." Darren moved, not with a groan, not with vengeance. He pushed up on one hand, slow, deliberate, as if weight itself had changed meaning. The motion was practiced, not reactive. He rose with the cadence of something rehearsed 1,000 times in solitude. From above, one of the banners surrendered. It drifted downward in languid spirals before crumpling beside the discarded weapon of a guard who hadn't noticed his holster come undone. Darren's fingers brushed his temple. 2 blinks. Across the summit's unseen spine, in layers of bedrock and reinforced alloy, the Harrowmark relay shifted, uncoiled, woke. Deep beneath the polished floor, dormant threads of code whispered from their tombs. Voltage arced across forgotten filaments. Language, long dead to the council's systems, slithered into active memory. Up above, a breeze that had no source twisted past the council dais. It brought with it a bitter dryness, like air drawn through ash. Darren Vosk exhaled slowly. Arx faltered. The laser plasma displays blinked once, all in sync. Static edged the corners, not enough to disrupt, just enough to remind. Along the outer chamber, 2 heads-up consoles snapped into terminal readouts. None of the staff had authorized. The words displayed were not in council standard. They were earthborn, archaic, burned into old language law, and banned from interstellar protocol. No negotiation, active. Voltron Sir turned to one of the aides. "Is that from our system?" The aide's face was pale, fins twitching along his jaw. It bypassed internal permissions. Arx backed a step. Darren raised his eyes. A long breath, too measured for recovery, spilled from his lips. Beneath the chamber, vibration crept through the walls, not a quake, not motion. A frequency, a thread running across the bones of the room. The council floor shimmered faintly. The lights overhead dimmed for exactly 1 second. That second passed like an executioner, waiting for the blade to drop. Flashback, silence training. Earth. He sat inside a chamber, where noise had no edges. The walls bled nothing. The room was soundless, lightless, a bubble inside the planet's crust. No sound penetrated. No sound emerged. Inside this capsule, Darren had survived 30 days without contact, surrounded by airborne nanophage vectors, each designed to trigger at biological stress signals. Speaking would activate them. Twitching would prime them. Breathing too sharply would invite a biochemical rewrite. Earth didn't train speakers. It trained survivors of silence. Back in the present, Darren stood. The blood on his cheek had crusted, left a small copper smear down his jaw. "What did you just do?" Voltron asked, voice dropped an octave. "Nothing," Darren replied, gaze steady. "You opened the door, I only walked through it." Arx turned to the nearest guard. "Seize him." No one moved. Heads-up security displays blinked red, not for intrusions, but invalid authentication. Guards stared at their gauntlets, at sidearms that no longer recognized their fingerprints. Lock override. Disabled. Every console showed the same message. Arc 30. Null. Somewhere in the summit, a deep mechanical shutter snapped closed. Yorick Ven's quill broke as he pressed too hard against the slate. The ink bled into the parchment, a spider web of meaning gone crooked. Another counselor's translation node sparked, fizzled, fell dead. Voices rose across the amphitheater, but none matched the content of the transmission. Each translation became nonsense, inverted or mirrored. Tharnik Vol backed away from the dais, stepping over the curled edge of the fallen banner. His tongue tasted copper, not blood. Electrical discharge from the failing environmental equalizers. Darren adjusted his collar. "You taught us to mimic your processes," he said, voice clearer now. "We mimicked your systems, we mirrored your laws, but while you spoke of peace, we trained to survive your peace, failing." Marvek Dor, orbiting far above in the cloaked array, saw the network spike. He didn't speak, he entered no command. The array responded to silence. In the chamber, one of the chandeliers flickered and dropped a shard. The crystal hit the floor and shattered. That, finally, was too much. A counselor screamed. It came late. By then the summit's floors were no longer idle. From beneath the primary podium, a panel slid open with the sound of scraped stone. A display activated. It showed a map of orbital structures. One by one, they began disappearing from the readout. Not destroyed, reclassified, non-existent. Arx lunged. Darren stepped aside. Arx collided with the open panel, staggered, looked up, and finally saw the blinking sequence pulsing through the chamber floor. 3 lights, then 2, then silence. The Harrow Mark protocol was no longer theoretical. The Council's systems were no longer theirs, and Earth had never been unarmed. It had simply never needed to raise a hand. Darren Vosk straightened his cuffs, then blinked twice more. "We've lost Fleet Path Delta." The technician didn't blink as he said it. He just kept looking upward, as though the ceiling would offer the explanation the displays refused to give. Kelvon Rax leaned forward, his hand hovering an inch above the comms relay, not quite ready to touch it. His eyes narrowed. Lost as in, repositioned. The operator's throat clicked. No, removed. Entire path signature deregistered. No explosion, no debris field, just gone. Voltron Sir's gaze locked on the heads-up feed above the command platform, its trajectory map now showing a vacancy where 6 interceptors had patrolled 10 seconds ago. Thin tracking lines, once marked with radiant motion trails, now curled inward toward a point that no longer existed. A subtle creak threaded through the mediation hall's upper dome, glass flexing as thermal distribution lost balance. Not enough to break, enough to warn. From the dais, Darren Vosk remained still. He didn't speak, didn't signal. He stood as if he'd been there for centuries, as if time wore itself down trying to interpret him. Eric's Jundal muttered, "Sensor error, that's all it is. Someone needs to recalibrate." Another ripple. The technician's voice cracked mid-sentence. Fleet Nexus C just unraveled. Yorick Venn, high in the gallery, squinted through his recorder's interface. The Council's orbital grid, their lifeline, their shield, their arrogance forged into circuitry, was deforming like wax under unseen fire. Lines blurred, labels vanished. The map was bleeding. Below, a table of dignitaries murmured in fracturing waves. Hands twitched toward emergency comms. Postures shifted inward. Confidence retreated under the ceiling's failing equilibrium. The room's silence grew teeth. Marvek Dor, still watching from the cloaked observation node outside Karen Terra's uppermost orbit, took in the panorama with clinical detachment. One screen showed the solar panel arrays shuddering with flicker sync discharges. Another showed a Council interceptor flicker like a bad memory, dissolve into black pixels, then vanish entirely. No fire, no noise. Absence. Phase 2's active, Dor murmured. They're not retreating, they're being rewritten. The operative next to him swallowed hard. Should we notify Earth? We are Earth? Dor answered. This was their message. Inside the mediation hall, the heads-up display above the dais pulsed. Not fast, not dramatic. A single blink, long and final, like the eye of a predator closing after the kill. The map collapsed into grayscale. The hall's temperature dropped, not in climate, but in spirit. Kelvon finally touched the console. Static licked across his fingertips. The interface refused authentication. "System rejected my command code," he said slowly. Voltron's jaw tightened. "Override it." "I can't." Kelvon stared down, disbelief creeping into his posture like rot. "It won't even read my clearance." Across the room, guards repositioned near the doors. One tried to ping the outer garrison. The badge on his chest blinked blue-red, then dead black. His jaw tightened. Another step toward the broadcast pit, reaching for the uplink. His fingers never touched the console. An invisible force shoved him backward, clean and silent, like gravity forgetting its contract with mass. Drask Merrick looked up from the feed just in time to see the guard hit the marble. No impact alarm, no fall protocol, just silence, sealing him in the moment. One of the larger banners collapsed near the center column. Its embroidered gold thread caught on a cracked rafter, tearing with a dry snap. A hush followed, the kind heard in mausoleums and aftermaths. Tharnik Vol's gill plates fluttered with involuntary contraction. His fingers moved along his belt for the concealed transmitter embedded under his sash. It wasn't there. He glanced down. The fabric hadn't been disturbed. The signal plate wasn't broken. It simply no longer existed, removed without trace, like someone had edited him mid-thought. Darren Vosk turned his head, just slightly. Enough for his line of sight to land on Tharnik. No movement followed, no expression changed. That gaze was enough. Voltron turned to Eric's. "We have to move now. We need launch authority," before Eric's shook his head slowly. "No one's firing without my order. You don't have the console anymore. I don't need it. I need obedience. That's not coming either." Outside, what should have been the halo of the Council's reserve fleet, 7 orbital guard stations, each with over 1,000 crew, had folded. Literally. The geometric interface, meant to relay their signatures, displayed a null state, a box within a box, repeating recursively until the software refused to draw it anymore. Yorick's hands hovered above his slate. His notes had become meaningless. You couldn't archive what no longer had context. He scrawled 2 words anyway. Void active. The atmospheric pressure in the mediation hall adjusted by 1/2 degree. No announcement accompanied it. But the glass above cracked just slightly deeper. A line no thicker than a strand of hair widened. Kelvon leaned close to his screen. "Do you hear that?" Voltron didn't answer. Because there was nothing to hear. No engines, no satellites adjusting orbit, no pings from the Council's black box recorders, just subtraction, slow, deliberate subtraction of presence. One by one, Eric's lunged toward the console on instinct. His palm slammed against the glass surface. The panel didn't acknowledge him. Instead, an error fed in thick lines across the top corner. Command redirected. Primary network disavowed. He hit it again. The words did not change. From outside the high windows, a bright dot flared briefly, then vanished. Another intercept unit. No one spoke the thought aloud. Voltron whispered without meaning to. "They're folding the orbitals without touching them." Eric's barked a reply. "That's impossible. You can't erase mass. You can only move it." Darren blinked once. Something in the floor beneath the dais trembled. Not an earthquake. Not vibration. Memory. Yorick, now halfway down the gallery steps, paused as he passed the banner that had once carried the emblem of the Ventralia Accord. He touched the fabric. It crumbled under his hand. Voltron stared at his communicator. The relay net's gone. Eric's face contorted. "No, that net is quantum-threaded through every moon in this sector. You'd need a rewrite at the root code level." Kelvon's voice had flattened. The word Earth wasn't spoken. It didn't have to be. Darren moved his hand, not dramatically, just enough to brush an invisible thread of dust off his sleeve. Voltron watched the gesture like one might watch a final lever being pulled. Above, one last interceptor flickered, warped and extinguished. No flash, no aftershock, just vacancy. And below, the Council's belief in their own permanence unstitched at the seams. "Bring him down." Voltron Sir's command snapped like brittle wire. The guards obeyed. Boots clattered against the dais steps. Their steps did not echo. Even the acoustics had thinned, dulled by something unspoken, saturating the room like static before a storm. The nearest soldier, a Bellic lieutenant wrapped in scaled ceremonial armor, lunged toward Darren Vosk. His movement carried no hesitation, only rehearsed aggression. But mid-air, the gauntlet around his arm flashed white, and then died. He hit the floor shoulder first, weaponless and disoriented. Another stepped in. His shock staff jolted to life, then cracked apart, severed by a frequency no one had broadcast. The pieces rattled across the marble tiles like dry seeds spilled from a broken pod. Darren hadn't moved. Not an inch. Not a twitch. His hands remained clasped behind him, posture rigid yet unthreatening. Heads-up displays flanking the chamber flared to red, then black, then nothing. A single line blinked across one panel, briefly readable, before vanishing. Fail-safe loop, engaged. Speech access, null. Tharnik Vol shoved away from his desk, mouth already forming a warning. The words didn't come, not even a whisper. His tongue moved, his lungs pushed air, but no sound emerged. Kelvon Rax grabbed his throat, not choking, just stunned. He tried to speak, tried again, failed. His fingers flew to his console in search of diagnostics. All nodes read green. The system didn't recognize the absence of sound as a problem. The center of the room, once a stage for declarations and conflict, had gone quiet not by force, but by design. Voltron Sir staggered toward Darren, hand pressed to a command fob strapped to his wrist. It blinked once, white, then blinked no more. He struck it, panicked. The screen replied with static symbols, non-alphabetic, recursive. Symbols he didn't recognize, symbols that weren't for him. One counselor collapsed beside his throne, mouth locked open in a silent scream. Another clawed at the dais, eyes bulging. Stillness wrapped them tighter. Not a prison, not a cage, just absence. The kind that spreads through nerves instead of steel. Darren blinked once. The induction columns embedded in the summit floor vibrated. The air sharpened, not in smell, not in temperature, but texture. Throat linings dried, vocal cords numbed, synaptic pathways misfired. Language, as a faculty, was no longer invited to the room. Yorick Venn, scribal observer, crouched at the edge of the upper gallery, stylus quivering over his slate. He had no orders to follow, no titles to protect, but he wrote anyway. The silence arrived like consequence. Eric's Jundal lurched forward, face blotched with confusion and fury. He shoved a stunned guard aside and barreled toward Darren, gesturing wildly, his lips forming accusations. He pointed. He glared. He stepped within striking distance, and froze. His body convulsed as if his spine had caught on an invisible thread. He stumbled backward, teeth clenched. Soundless agony spread across his expression, like a tide. Darren's eyes didn't follow him. He studied the room, not the man. Voltron pulled at his collar, sweat mixing with dry dust, settling from the shattered ceiling above. The banners, limp and silent, fluttered no more. The chamber crest, an enameled mosaic of interlocking sigils etched into the dais, flickered beneath the shifting light. Then it cracked. A long wandering fracture cleaved it in half. Flashback. When we burned our own. Darren stood in a control bunker, buried beneath the remains of Earth's first off-world colony. Outside, the air glowed orange, chemtrails, anti-personnel clouds, systems gone offline by intentional overload. Are they clear? Arvek Halden's voice was calm, not cold, not bitter, just resolved. Darren checked the feed. The last evac pulled out 4 minutes ago. Arvek nodded. Then trigger it. Darren hesitated. Arvek said nothing more. He didn't have to. Darren pressed the pad. The city vanished. Not with fire, not with noise. It folded. Systems unraveled like undone stitches. Towers flattened into themselves. Satellites blinked out above it, choosing deletion over corruption. Earth had learned. If peace couldn't be preserved, memory would be erased clean. Back to the summit. Darren stepped forward, one measured stride. Voltron Sir tried to raise his hand. It barely twitched. His thoughts flailed for action, yet no order completed itself. Tharnik pounded his fist against the console. The system lit up, then darkened, then replied with a flat line across all functions. Yorick wrote again. When sound abandoned them, their minds followed. One of the outer guards pressed himself flat against the wall. He tried to mouth a prayer, failed. He reached for his sidearm. The weapon's casing shattered in his palm. The induction frequency deepened. Nothing screeched, nothing blared. Just a baseline throb below cognition, threading through skulls like a whisper, trying to remember what it once was. Darren stood before the council, every delegate breathing, every voice stolen. Eric's reached for his ceremonial blade. It melted. Kelvon collapsed to his knees, one hand gripping the floor. He looked up at Darren, not pleading, not cursing, just recognizing. Darren didn't meet his eyes. He didn't need to. The summit lighting stuttered, not failing, adjusting. Above them, the central lens of the summit chamber's eye-like ceiling rotated inward. Surveillance optics folded away. External transmissions blinked off. A solitary feed remained, wired to Earth. Yorick's slate glowed faintly. He added one last line. They brought weapons. Earth brought something they couldn't name. Voltron Sir sagged against the dais, blinking hard. His thoughts ran in circles. Every reflex betrayed him. Every muscle delayed by seconds. Darren folded his hands again. Silence had become law, the kind that couldn't be repealed. Initiate veil drop. Confirm orbital silence. Marvik Dor's words didn't echo. The command station was built to absorb every sound, to let no reaction betray itself. He stood at the apex of a disc-shaped console chamber, surrounded by tiered operators who each wore layered light filter visors and pressure-resistant gloves. No one asked questions here. Not on Array Deck 1, not at this height. The obsidian array began to open. Thousands of kilometers below, Terra shimmered with decaying dignity, its capital still adorned in the ceremonial golds of summit season. From orbit, it looked unchanged, but Marvik's screens told a different truth. The heads-up displays split into latticed overlays, one for each continent, every node mapped in slow dissolution. Satellites blinked out like seeds in frost. Atmospheric regulators wobbled out of phase. Subsurface comm beacons screamed silently and died. Outside the array hull, black petal-like structures unfolded with glacial grace. Each bloom revealed a segmented core lined with phased absorbers and unspoken machinery, unmarked, unnamed. They drifted into new configurations, guided by a lattice no longer visible even to those who built it. The silence wasn't tactical, it was sacred. Local harmonic mesh has dissolved, one technician reported, reading lines of disappearing telemetry. Shielding collapse underway, interference now self-replicating. Marvik nodded once. He didn't blink. Below him, the counselors still clawed at systems that no longer obeyed. The banners above their summit thrones drooped into the stillness. No ripple, no flare of resistance, just slowly thickening air, and the grind of planetary logic being rewritten from space. Array Deck 3 began its low-band pulse. You couldn't hear it, you could only notice what was no longer there. Command authority across 6 districts of Terra inverted. Eric's Jundal's private line cut itself from the network before he could finish the override gesture. His security encryption shattered into meaningless glyphs, auto-erased from history. The defense grids below flickered like exhausted candles, stripped of their inputs before they could even react. "We are dark," came the next report. Marvik turned from the central viewport, letting his gaze sweep the projection wall. Black glass now. No readouts, no simulations, just confirmation. Observation complete. Deterrence engaged. Obsidian Node 5 rotated silently, targeting the city's thermal stabilizers, not to destroy, just to take. Once detached from their synchronization pulses, the atmospheric conditioners began spiraling. A heat wave began to drift unnaturally north, guided not by storm fronts, but by absence. Down on the summit floor, Tharnik Vol tried again to reignite the evacuation conduits. The retinal scanner refused his gaze. A red cross flared across the heads-up unit, then vanished. Beside him, Kelvin Rax had begun tearing through a manual access panel with his bare hands, stripping skin from his knuckles in the process. No system granted him authority. Not anymore. Darren Vosk stood at the center of the dome, gaze lifted, not to the council, but to the distant ceiling. He could feel it, though no signal passed through him. The drop had begun. The array was alive. A shimmer crawled across the chamber's lights. Fluorescent edges grew dim, then warped into an indistinct dusk. Sound itself thickened, not vanishing, but dragging. Boots scraped differently. Cloth brushed more slowly. Even speech, when attempted, felt blunted by unseen drag. "Do we have confirmation on Phase 2? A junior tech asked from Marvik's right, not daring to turn his head. "You're looking at it," Marvik answered. Everywhere the city's symmetry unraveled. Transit hubs froze mid-cycle. Autonomous port systems looped dead-frame signals. Defense towers ceased their orbital tracking. One by one, shield arrays folded into themselves, their signatures not lost, but unacknowledged. The satellites simply no longer saw them. The array didn't jam, it forgot. Below, the council chamber's highest lens, meant to show safe orbit positions, displayed nothing but static bands. Councilors stared up as if their own sky had betrayed them. Eric's Jundal screamed silently at the ceiling, his gestures no longer read by any device. His voice was not forbidden, it was bypassed. Marvik stepped away from the console. Behind him, the central axis of the control room shifted its alignment. One arm detached, repositioned toward Corinne Terra's equatorial band, and began emitting an unbroken harmonic designed not to destroy matter, but to thin its context. Regions of the city began to drift subtly off registry, buildings no longer quite where they were, streets remembered by one system, but unseen by another, maps desynchronized, coordinates fractured. Still, no explosion, no attack, just subtraction. Phase 3 on standby, a voice said near the rear of the deck. Marvik didn't respond immediately. He looked toward a single windowed alcove on the right side of the room, an observation bay sealed from noise. Inside, 3 Terran envoys stood with hands clasped behind their backs. They hadn't spoken since arrival, they watched only the loss. Down below, a junior scribe named Yorick Venn collapsed against a wall, his writing slate blinking in confusion. Every attempt to log data now returned the same message, redundant. He scratched at his temple, smearing sweat into the dust that now caked parts of the chamber. His gaze lifted to Darren, still, silent, exiled from chaos. Darren had not moved in minutes. His eyes hadn't closed. He stood not as victor, but as verdict. Marvik returned to his post. Deploy final drift, array dispersal. Above the planet, the petals of the obsidian structure shifted one final time, each node disengaged from the others, floating into staggered low-orbit tracks. Their heat signatures vanished beneath layered shells. No tracer could follow them. They became suggestion, not structure. From the city's remaining thermal feed towers, waves of static poured outward, blocking even residual atmospheric echo. Darren stepped once to the side. That motion triggered the chamber's fallback lights to cycle into fail silence. Not red, not alert, just black, black and breathless. In the last corner of the summit, Voltron Sir sat slumped against a control dais. His hands lay flat, uncurled. A trickle of dried blood ran from one nostril, trailing down his jaw. He wasn't unconscious. He had just reached the edge of instruction. The Council had nothing left to activate. From the orbiting shell of dead satellites, a single line was transmitted down through the command relay, deliberately late, so it would be the only message the summit's heads-up display would still receive. It appeared across all panels in uniform font: "You are being watched." Marvik stepped back from the interface, the mission complete without thunder. No explosions, no fleets, just absence, carved slowly, until the shape of Earth's intention remained. "Tell it to engage." Tharnik Vol's voice broke through the dying light like a blade dragged across frost. His knuckles trembled against the command console. The heads-up display blinked once, red, then black. He stared at it, as if brute will could reverse entropy. The command string refused him. Again, Arik's Jundal hunched beside the fractured floor sigil, clutching a cracked relay node to his chest. "Override it," he croaked, breath sharp and rasping. "We are the Council." No response. The system didn't recognize his authority anymore, because authority had expired. Not suddenly, slowly. Somewhere in the past, Earth had buried the clock. Now it simply ran out. Above them, the ceiling groaned again. Another joint surrendered to tension unseen, sliding dust in a soft drizzle over their shoulders. The air itself felt misaligned, like gravity had started rethinking its priorities. Kelvon Rax stood frozen at the eastern console cluster, hands held inches above the panel. "The exit tunnels, they're still mapped," he muttered to no one in particular. "If we follow Route 13, we can breach the surface." "There is no surface anymore," Voltron Sir whispered, though his voice lacked argument. It was a statement, not of fact, but of loss. Earth owns every frequency, every inch of lift space, every fallback. Another attempt. Execute, vault escape, scrolled across the display before disintegrating into a series of glyphs, no longer defined by their language library. Scrambled data, misindexed logic. Even the fonts had given up. Behind them, the ceremonial chamber remained dimly lit by the failing floor nodes. Once ceremonial, now a cage carved in gold leaf and marble fractures. The sigil at its center, the stylized trimark of galactic unity, had split down the middle. Darren Vosk's bootprint bisected it cleanly. He had moved on. Outside, nothing was visible, not because the skies were dark, but because there were no transmission sources left. Earth hadn't fired a weapon. They'd just subtracted the galaxy. Tharnik tried another code, relay_armada_alpha. No sound, just a soft buzz like breath against a mirror. The fleet was no longer offline. It was non-existent. Back the emergency staff into the lower lifts, Arx ordered, gripping the wall for balance as another tremor passed beneath their feet. We re-coordinate from the secondary observatory. Voltron didn't budge. There is no lift. There is no observatory. We don't move. We descend. Yorick Venn hadn't spoken since the ceiling caved in behind the upper press gallery. His hands shook over a cracked slate. Notes, half-written, vanished with every flicker of signal loss. He scrawled the same sentence 4 times, each more fractured than the last. We never heard it coming. We never heard it coming. We never heard it. He dropped the stylus. On the southern balcony, 2 guards stood motionless beside the now locked gate. Their rifles hung loosely, inert. The triggers didn't click. Their boots left no prints on the dust-covered stone. The hallway behind them pulsed with dark, unfamiliar cold. Across the chamber, a final message crept across the last active screen. Not bold, not even centered, just an afterthought that arrived late to its own funeral. Protocol, Harrow mark complete. Marvek Dor had written the phrase decades ago, in an Earth archive no council system had ever successfully infiltrated. It wasn't a warning, it was a note for posterity. Get the sky feeds. Arx barked again. Something, a thermal trace, radiation scatter, anything, but the screens gave nothing. The council's skies were no longer owned. They were borrowed, and the lender had pulled the contract. Tharnik stepped backward, away from the blank console, and sank slowly to the stone beside a toppled node array. When did it start? He whispered. How did we not? The day we approved Earth's trade license, Voltron said bitterly. They didn't need weapons, they needed infrastructure. We handed it to them, notarized. Kelvon turned, eyes wide. You're saying this was written from the beginning? No. Voltron's eyes stayed fixed on the laser plasma display now filled with ghost code. It wasn't written, it was installed. In the rear of the hall, one of the marble statues, a monument to some long-dead founding arbiter, tilted on its base, then collapsed. The crash was startling, not because of its volume, but because it was the first object in hours to make a sound that wasn't digital. Marvek Dor's satellite data stream, relayed silently from the obsidian array, showed nothing, not nothing, like a black screen. Nothing like the absence of observation, a strategic vacuum. They didn't attack us, Kelvon said finally, eyes locked on a spinning fragment of the statue's crown as it rolled to a stop. They didn't even intervene. They authored our obsolescence, Voltron said. Arx stumbled forward. There has to be a counter-signal, something uncorrupted. Authorization expired. They're not even here. Voltron smiled without warmth. And yet we are not. The air inside the chamber had changed. It didn't choke. It didn't chill. It simply stopped being familiar. Every breath felt like someone else's. Every moment stretched not from time, but from absence of interruption. At the gate, the guards finally moved. One placed his rifle gently on the ground, then stepped back. The other followed suit, his eyes distant, unfocused. Not surrender, not protest, recognition. At the center of the floor, Darren Vosk had left no message, no trace, no blood, only silence, still vibrating from the sigil's broken geometry. Yorick found one last line crawling through his slate's corrupted memory buffer, unsigned, time-stamped before the summit even began. Silence is not a gap. It is a verdict. Arx Jundal reached for the sidearm at his belt. It wasn't there, and neither, any more was he. Got it. I'm ready to write the final part of your story. Part 8. The message was silence, with no image generation. Writing now. Please hold a moment. They're not responding. Kelvin Rax's voice cracked the silence like dry leaves breaking underfoot. No one answered. Not Voltron Sir, whose trembling hands hovered uselessly over the control slate. Not Tharnik Vol, who sat crumpled at the base of the council crest, robes streaked with dust and failure. And certainly not Eric's Jundel, who had not stood since the crest had fractured beneath his outstretched hand. No more orders. No more commands. The council's warships had been unmade, their satellites hollowed, their words stolen mid-thought. Darren Volsk stepped down from the dais. His boots made no sound. The laser plasma displays overhead, once blazing with territorial charts and orbital telemetry, flickered in stuttering static. Only one remained active, suspended above the central chamber like a verdict cast in light. It carried no emblem, no crest, just a single line scrolling in clinical, frozen text. Negotiation terminated. No one spoke. They couldn't. The induction frequencies had seen to that. But even if voices returned, the chamber would have stayed quiet. Darren didn't need them to understand. He needed them to remember. He passed Voltron without a glance. The once defiant officer knelt, one hand still on his broken transmitter, the other clenching a relic blade that had never drawn use. His lips moved silently, not in prayer, but in a private attempt to recall the last moment he'd believed they were in control. Behind them, the banners drooped further, their gold-threaded seams now pulled free by unseen static currents, unraveling like confessions, whispered too late. The treaties inked beneath those banners had long since turned to ash, first ideologically, now physically. Pages twisted across the marble like fleeing birds, the gusts from the fractured dome, sending them into spiral retreats toward the outer balconies. And still, Darren walked. His path past the vacant earth chair, placed there as a courtesy. Its presence had once been a joke, now no one dared look directly at it. The chair remained empty, but not unoccupied. It echoed with memory. A flash, unbidden, crossed Darren's thoughts, not from the chamber, far from it. The white chamber, the training vault, his breath catching inside recycled air, the pressure silence brings. A voice from years gone, Arvek Halden, calm even as the walls throbbed with the viral resonance. The seat they offer isn't for speaking from, it's a reminder. We sit in it only once, then leave it behind like a curse. The memory dissolved. Darren stopped at the summit's grand threshold. The doors, splintered open by the shockwave of their own protocol collapse, hung like broken jaws, hinges twisted from the energy flux collapse. Behind him, no footstep followed, no voice called, no authority dared rise. He turned. Every face in the room, alien, adorned, armored, was lowered, not out of respect, not in mourning, but in stunned, irreversible comprehension. They weren't conquered. They'd been catalogued, filed away under lessons delayed, sealed behind the kind of silence only a graveyard truly understands. Darren lifted his left hand, not as a gesture of farewell, but as the final movement in a script centuries in rehearsal. The silver band at his wrist glinted briefly as the chamber's ambient lighting flickered its last breath. From that point forward, no Earth signal would remain in this hall, only its result. As he turned again, and stepped past the last threshold, a burst of hot wind funneled through the fractured dome, catching a half-burned treaty page mid-spin. It scraped across the council floor, flapping once against the dead crest before vanishing into the broken rafters. Yorick Venn, hunched near the upper observation tier, watched Darren's silhouette dissolve into the shadows of the shattered exterior hallway. He tried to write. His hands didn't obey. Somewhere above, the last orbital node of the obsidian array blinked twice and folded into non-existence. No one gave the order. It simply knew it was done. A final display near the chamber's south alcove, one often reserved for inter-council translation, flickered with residual data before shutting down entirely. In its final burst of life, a line surfaced, sovereignty, record. Beneath the chamber floor, the atmospheric grid purged its final diagnostic, showing every planetary defense node redlined and disabled. Earth hadn't just cut them off from orbit, it had erased their ownership of themselves. Tharnik Vol shuddered once, and let his forehead rest against the shattered remains of the podium. He didn't cry. He couldn't. Whatever dignity he still held was buried under the soundless weight of what Earth had shown them. Not rage, not superiority, but conclusion. In the wake of silence, there was no argument, only memory. Outside, wind curled through the blackened arches, scattering dust across the mosaic floors. No anthem rose, no lights blazed, yet something lingered. Near the Earth delegation's once empty seat, a single, upright object stood untouched by the chaos, a black obelisk, unmarked, smooth, barely the height of a child. Its presence hadn't been there at the beginning of the summit. No one had seen it placed, but now it stood unmovable, halfway between monument and marker. Voltron Sir staggered toward it once, his knees rebelling beneath the effort, his hand extended halfway, as if expecting resistance. None came, and yet he did not touch it. Some instincts remain even after all else has failed. From orbit, Corintera's sky finally darkened completely, not from nightfall, but from absence. The Council's presence had once lit it like a constellation of arrogance. Now it held only silence, a mirror, a warning. Back in the chamber, the last of the internal systems coughed once more and died. No resurrection followed. Yorick Venn, hands shaking, finally managed to carve one sentence into his recording slate. It wasn't meant for official archives. He didn't know who it was meant for, only that it had to be written. Earth never raised its voice, and that is how it was heard. Outside the chamber doors, the figure of Darren Volsk disappeared into the ravaged corridors of the capital's summit grounds. He left behind no speech, no demand, no conquest, only the understanding that Earth had entered the chamber, not to debate the future, but to end the question. And when the galaxy would ask, centuries from now, why the Council never truly rose again, the answer would remain what it had always been: not vengeance, not war, just the memory of silence that knew when to walk away.